Thank you very much. Thank you, and welcome to Broadway Buzz, and welcome to HADESTOWN, the myth, the musical. You're in for an absolutely extraordinary and groundbreaking evening. You know, rarely in the theater we have these works that literally transform the musical theater. I'm thinking about an event in the 1960s when the Fantastics opened. Keep in mind, in that period, everything about the musical was meant to be big, bigger, biggest. And so suddenly, when the Fantastics came along, and it was this tiny little musical done on a bare stage with 10 actors, with a piano and a harp, not a 26-piece orchestra, no singing and dancing chorus. And when they wanted to have scenic effects, when the moon rose, a little mime cut out a paper moon and held it up. And it was absolutely magic. It was the essence of what theater is, looking into the face of mystery. And it was exceedingly powerful, and that tiny little musical would literally transform the musical theater. And in the same way, you're seeing a show tonight that is a folk opera that literally transforms and redefines the musical theater. We have to reconsider choreography. We have to reconsider special effects and visuals. We have to reconsider the sound of the musical. Keep in mind, this is the only musical that I know of that was totally written on string instruments. We know that all of our music for the musical theater comes from a keyboard. And so whether it's a piano or a synthesizer, that gives us our sound for the musical. So we're hearing a totally different kind of sound being produced to create this delicate, fragile, poetic, sensitive journey that we're going to be taken on. So let us go to the beginning and consider where all this comes from. We have to start, of course, by talking about the notion of myths and legends. In the ancient world, whenever we had something that was unknown, it was answered by myths or legends. So this concept, in the ancient world, we had the universe looking up at the sky. That's where the gods lived. We had Earth, which is where the humans lived. And then we had what was below the Earth, that was called, in ancient times, Hades, which was where all of the dead souls would go. So we have the idea of the world of the dead, the world of the living, and the world of the gods. And what happened with myths and legends is, the ancients wanted us to be connected to the gods that would influence us. They would answer the great universal questions for us. So in doing this, they created mythology that would focus around the life of the gods, but it would be done in such a way that the gods became more human, more real, more acceptable to us, more identifiable to us. But always they would be asking those great universal questions. Who am I? Where am I going? Why am I here? And this notion of what happens to us after life, the issue of death, which has been the ultimate question that has always haunted mankind. So all the great philosophers, all the great religions, all the great myths deal with this issue. I want you to be very aware of this idea of cyclic mythology and cyclic myths. Keep in mind the whole notion of a day, sunrise, high noon, sunset, the end of the day and darkness. We go through this cycle, and every day there is a new day, and there is a rebirth, a regeneration. In the same way with the seasons, we go spring, summer, fall, winter, and that cycle keeps repeating itself. In the human cycle, we have birth, maturity, old age, death. Same cyclic pattern. So this issue of death haunts us, and it's been in every culture, of course, and it's the unanswered question, where do we go? So we're going to focus on an extraordinary tale, the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice. As you remember, Orpheus is the god of music. He creates his music on a little stringed lute. His aim is to write a song that will transform mankind. He falls in love with a young girl, Eurydice. They marry, and on their wedding day, she is bitten by a snake and dies and goes to Hades, that is, the underworld. The premise of the Orpheus legend is that Orpheus will go to the underworld to try and redeem Eurydice and bring her back to the human world. I mean, if we just pause for a moment, we think of that cycle. Whenever we have gone through grief in our lives, of course, what we want to do is to bring back that person that we've lost. The absence is unbearable to us. But in the scheme of nature, I mean, the dead are, below the ground, the living are on the earth, and the gods are in the sky. So the story of Orpheus is a very compelling story that sort of challenges the order of nature. Orpheus is saying, I'm going to go into the underworld, I'm going to find Eurydice, and I'm going to bring her back. And that is the basis of this extraordinary legend. I mean, keep in mind, in the ancient world, Ovid treated it, Plato treated it, Virgil treated it, all the way down to modern times. There have been operas, ballets, musical compositions, great plays in the early 20th century by Camus and Sartre and Tennessee Williams, incidentally, who wrote Orpheus Descending. And then, of course, right to the present, we have Sarah Ruhl, who's one of our great feminist writers, who writes about the Orpheus legend. So it's a legend that has always stayed with us because it is a legend that is so close to all of us, and all of us relate to the emotions that Orpheus is going through in wanting to regain his love for Eurydice. Okay, so in this tale that we're going to see, we know that we'll focus on Orpheus and Eurydice, but also it focuses very strongly on Hades and Persephone. Hades is the king of the underworld. He is the king of death. But he is also inordinately powerful, and he is the king of industry. So in this story that you watch the power of industry as we move into the underworld, as we move into HADESTOWN, as it's called in this story, and see how this notion of industry can dehumanize man. The workers, by the time they move to the underworld, they're the dead souls. They are working in a way where they forget who they were on earth, what their capacity was on earth. They even forget their names. They're just bent over doing the work. So watch the power of Hades in this story. But to humanize Hades, we know in the myth about Hades that he was deeply in love with Persephone. Persephone is the goddess of the seasons. When she decides to marry Hades, she will leave the world that we know and spend 6 months a year in the underworld. When she goes in the underworld, we have fall and winter, and the world goes, into a barren state. So this is a very interesting love story. It's a love story that affects all of mankind. But again, it humanizes Hades because we see he has the capacity for love also, and he wants to maintain that human quality of loving and being loved. So we have these four figures that will play a very important part in the brilliant way this story is told. We're also introduced then to a character named Hermes, and Hermes is the god, is the messenger to the gods. But aside from being the messenger to the gods, he also leads all of the dead souls to the underworld. So they go from their human state to their state of, non-living. And it's a very powerful role. Watch Hermes very carefully. He's like the master of ceremonies of this story. He is like the head of an ancient Greek chorus. He speaks to us very directly. At the beginning of the show, all of the actors come out on the stage, and suddenly the moment Hermes arrives, everything changes. And we realize that we're starting on an ancient mission, and we're stepping into an ancient myth and an ancient story. And he will speak to us, speak to the characters on stage, direct Orpheus on his journey. Listen very carefully to him, because like the leader of a Greek chorus, he gives us the information we have to know. He establishes the status quo, he establishes the issues of the story, and then he leads us through it. He's given some of the most beautiful music, incidentally, in the show. And then we have the characters of the Fates. And the Fates are really our destiny. In the ancient Greek world, they believed that the Fates knew when we would be born, how we would live our lives, what our obstacles would be in life, how we would resolve them, and how and when we would die. So they have an extraordinary knowledge of our being. The Greeks believed, however, that there was definitely free will. So we were not just simply puppets of the gods. The Fates were not telling us what to do. They were describing what they knew we would do. So they have a superior knowledge. It would be like you going to a doctor and the doctor saying you're ill. He doesn't doom you to being ill because of his superior knowledge. He knows that you are ill, and that's how the Fates work. Watch how brilliantly they're used in the story. The kind of music they use, the idiom of the music they use, how they give information, and a very strong sense of atmosphere for the audience. So we're living in this world then of Greek mythology as a modern story is being told. Okay, let me go back and remind you. I want to go back again to the golden age of Greece and remind you of this. We know that in ancient times, these stories were passed on by storytellers, and they would change. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, in the way these stories and these myths are developed. So over this long passage of time, the storyteller changes the way he tells the story. But then also remember, there's a whole period of time when instead of telling the story in an oral way, they would sing the story. So therefore, we would have troubadours, and we would have sort of sacred songs that would tell the story of the myth. By the time we get to ancient Greece, this is 5 centuries BC, let me remind you also that every culture in the world has its own mythology, and they're all very different. I mean, the Chinese mythology is very different from the Indian mythology, very different from the Aboriginal mythologies that happen at the bottom of the world. So we have so many different ways of dealing with the mysteries of life. But the thing I want to stress about all the myths, whatever the culture, whatever the idiom, they all deal with the same thing, our humanness. And one of the really important things to realize when we hear this story, and I think you feel this when you're in the theater witnessing what happens, we're not really thinking about this in the modern way where we define ourselves by defining what our nationality is, what our culture is, what our religion is, what our sexual preference is. All of that is erased. And what the ancient stories tell us is who we are as humans. Remember, just a few weeks ago, we had that green comet pass over the Earth. And if you were lucky enough to see that green streak, you realize that the last people on Earth to see that saw it 55 million years ago. This is extraordinary. But we all connect to the same thing, to the mystery. And that's what mythology does. It asks us to look deep into the face of mystery, to deal with those universal questions. Who am I? What am I doing? Where am I going? To have us try to answer those questions, not as Americans, not as Democrats, not as whatever, Catholics, doesn't matter. We're just doing it for who we are as human. And it's the most basic way of telling a story. What happened in Greece in this period, in 5 centuries BC, This is the birth of modern drama in the Western world. And what would happen is Aristotle would write a brilliant work called the Poetics, where he would define how a story should be told theatrically, that there has to be a central character who goes on a journey, who is confronted by issues, who is tested by issues, who has to confront and answer those issues until he comes out on the other side. So basically what we're always seeing is a journey that is 1, emotional, 2, psychological, 3, philosophic, and it takes us on these very profound journeys of discovery. That's what we're going to do when we watch Orpheus in this story. But the Greeks then would literally codify this in the first great plays of the Western world. And the great writers like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides would take these ancient legends and treat them in a special way. So the thing I want you to realize is in that Greek culture, everyone knew a story, for example. So one of the great stories from the ancient culture would be Oedipus, the story of the man who kills his father, marries his mother, and gouges his eyes out. That's the character of Oedipus. Everyone in the ancient world knew that mythology, but everyone went to the theater to see how the great playwright Sophocles would treat that story. So everything is about irony. We know the outcome. We know what happens to Orpheus, most of us do. We know what happened to Oedipus, but we go to see how the writer treats the story. And that's how we go to see this show, to see how the brilliant writer Aeneas Mitchell, who wrote the book, the words, the story, and developed it as a modern and very provocative tale. So we're going for treatment. We're going to see how the artist treats the story. Okay, so this is sort of the background. The only other thing I want you to be aware of from this period is the Greeks believed so strongly in free will. There were those ancient cultures that believed in predestination, that we were only the puppets of the gods, but the Greeks in their Enlightenment knew that the human spirit was a very rare spirit that would make choices of its own, and that free will is everything. And that's, of course, the basis for all drama, of course. Free will, the ability to make a choice. And so watch how powerfully this is all developed in this story. Okay, so there is this big background, a long history of Orpheus and his journey. One other thing I want you to be aware of, there is a great writer named Joseph Campbell, who in the 1970s gave some of the most exciting lectures on public television, and it was on the idea of mythology and the power of mythology and the importance of mythology. And long before we had religions, remember, we had mythology, and it was the thing that would connect a group of people. It was the thing that would give a group of people its continuity and heritage. And so Joseph Campbell lectured on this in the most brilliant way. You can see those lectures on television. They're easily accessible on YouTube. He's written countless books that many of you probably have memorized, but his most famous book is called The Hero's Journey, which is about the idea of the epic hero who takes us on a journey that will not only transform his life, but will transform ours. Okay, so in light of that, then let us look at Aeneas Mitchell. Aeneas Mitchell, the time now is 2006. Aeneas Mitchell has graduated from Middlebury College. She's established herself as a very up-and-coming folk singer. She writes very compelling music. Even back in 2006, she had a fan base that was really so devoted to her. They thought of her as a priestess. They thought of her as a prophet. They thought of her as a mystic because she wrote so poetically about the human condition. And she continues to do that in this brilliant work we're going to see in HADESTOWN. So in any case, how all this happened. Aeneas Mitchell worked with a group of like-minded folk singers, so she had a group of about 4 or 5 string musicians who played with her regularly, and they would tour. They were based in Vermont, and they would tour around America. So one night she was coming home, they were 700 miles away, and they were driving all night to get back home after a long concert tour they were on. And Anais Mitchell had a sort of epiphany as she was driving in the middle of the night. A song came to her, and she used the word channeling, meaning that the song just came to her. It was a song that the universe, she believed, the universe had created, and it just came to her. And she remembered all of the melodic line of it. She forgot the lyrics, but she remembered the melodic line. It will be the song, Wait for Me. It's a song you will hear near the end of the first act, and you will hear it again reprieved near the end of the second act. It's a very haunting song. In the story of Orpheus, Orpheus says, I want to write a song that will change mankind. Well, this comes close to being that song. And in any case, this song came to her, and with it came the idea of doing a treatment about the Orpheus and Eurydice legend. So in the course of a year, from 2006 to 2007, Anais Mitchell would write with her group of musicians, would write a song cycle that she performed in 2007 in a little coffee house in Vermont in 2007. It immediately created a kind of cult following. So imagine this. It's sort of, 5 musicians standing in front of a microphone playing stringed instruments, singing the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. So they are telling the story in the tradition of the troubadour, singing the story, which they do, and it's enormously powerful. They would then take it on a tour. She would contact her fans and say, if you buy coffee mugs and t-shirts, I'll take the money and try and do a concept album of this show, which she presented in 2010. And for those of you who love this musical, I really recommend that you go back to that original song cycle that she wrote. Many of the songs you hear in the show are still in that original song cycle, but you will see how it was developed from what was literally a sort of stand-up concert into this extraordinary theatrical piece that it is. Okay, so once this happens in 2010, the album really starts selling exceedingly well, and she goes on a 60-city tour where she picks up an enormous number of followers and devotees, and there were people who went from concert to concert to concert all over America as she was performing. It had this very strong cult following. So something would happen in 2012 that would change everything. So what we can summarize about this concert up to this point. They conceived it, they wore clothes, costumes, and the costumes were sort of 1930s Depression area clothes, and the setting was sort of New Orleans. So the feeling was, it was sort of Woody Guthrie goes to a New Orleans jazz club. That's what the feeling of that evening is. The music is this wonderful eclectic mix of Woody Guthrie-like folk music, and then this very sexy, sensuous New Orleans jazz sound that will work brilliantly, for example, for the Fates when they sing. And they're all sort of in 1930s-like clothes. Keep in mind, in this period, this is the period right after the Great Depression. It's the period when the Dust Bowl happened. It was an apocalyptic period in America. And people were suffering and starving, and there was no food, and poverty was very much a present force. And so it was the basis for the telling of this original tale. But what would happen in 2012 is that Anais Mitchell would meet Rachel Chafkin. And Rachel Chafkin is a brilliant American director. We followed her in the theater, those of us who were following the really off-Broadway stuff that was happening in New York. Rachel Chafkin did a show in a tent that was so powerful, it was moved finally to a major Broadway theater. It was called Natasha, Pierre, and the Comet of 1812. And the premise of that musical was really distilling War and Peace into a very small segment And it was such a compelling work that, in my mind, it was one of the great theater experiences I had in the last 20 years. But it established Rachel Chafkin as a brilliant visual theatrical storyteller. So she would meet Anais Mitchell, and they would work for 4 years on developing this into a proper musical. In fact, what they really did was Rachel Chafkin turned it into a Greek tragedy. So Rachel Chafkin knew all of the history of the ancient Greek theaters, knew Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, all of the works of Aristotle and the Poetics. And so she put together retelling this story so that she would add the character Hermes, who, as I told you, is the messenger to the gods, and he is the leader of an ancient Greek chorus. So that brings the idea of the Greek chorus into play. She then would create a chorus that would be called the workers, and they would be developed in the same way. Keep in mind, in the ancient Greek tragedies or comedies, there was a chorus that was a singing, dancing chorus. So when we talk about our modern American musical, we really have to go back 2,500 BC, because that's where it really started. And so in any case, she uses these workers in a very powerful and emotional way to add all of the atmosphere of the modern telling of the Orpheus and Eurydice tale that we're going to see. So they open it at the New York Theater Workshop in 2016. It's enormously successful. It's done in a small, intimate 200-seat theater space. The audience basically sits almost in the round around this show. But now the focus is very strongly on it looking like a Greek tragedy and being played like a Greek tragedy. And so it takes away the concert aspect of it. But they kept all of the atmosphere and all of the musical sounds of New Orleans, so that is all still there. But now it's sort of placed in an ancient Greek amphitheater in a way. Keep in mind, in the Greek amphitheater, there was always a large open area called the orchestra where all of the action would happen. Watch how that's used in this show. When you go into the theater, you literally see musicians on stage. You see 6 musicians on stage, and it looks like a New Orleans jazz club, like Preservation Hall is what they really based it on. And so it looks like that. But when you see the story played out, it turns into a Greek tragedy. Watch how they use a turntable that is used in the orchestra and gives the show its tremendous and compelling movement and action. Keep in mind, this is a story about a journey into hell. So watch how brilliantly that is realized. Okay, so the show is enormously successful in 2016 in New York, but they decide it isn't ready to go to Broadway. They take it to Edmonton, Canada, where it plays in a 1,600-seat proscenium theater, very like one of the theaters here at Playhouse Square, where they are reassured that the show will play in that kind of less intimate environment. Then a magical thing happens. The National Theatre of Great Britain hires them to come to the National Theatre to open the 2017 season in London, and they present it in the Olivier Theatre, which is the largest thrust stage in Europe, and it's received brilliantly. It then transfers to New York, where it is nominated for 14 Tony Awards, ultimately winning 8. In my mind, they should have won all of them. It's an extraordinary and groundbreaking work. So what you're seeing, and when you watch this, things will appear to be very contemporary. They deal with issues of climate change. They deal with issues of poverty. They deal with issues about a wall. But keep in mind, Anais Mitchell wrote the big song that ends the first act called The Wall, which is the story of how we separate ourselves from those people. It's a very powerful song. But she wrote it long before, she wrote it in 2006, so she wrote it long before the issue of the wall in American politics would take such prominence, of course, in the last political cycle, where we were keeping, people out from our southern border. It's an issue that still dominates us today. So this show reverberates with countless issues that are contemporary and political. But what I want you to remember is that really these are ancient ideas. I mean, keep in mind the Greeks 2,500 years ago had city-states where they built their cities within walls. So we have been spending our lifetimes separating one another from walls. Of course, we just experienced the greatest wall of all with COVID, where we were separated from loved ones, from family. We were put into complete kind of isolation. So this show reverberates for us, not because it's so contemporary, but because it's so ancient. So remember that as you watch this extraordinary work tonight. Enjoy this magnificent work, HADESTOWN. Thank you.